सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
This week's argument risks failing the test of what's appropriate given the awful violence that Israeli armed forces are raining on Gaza right now. The point, however, needs to be made sooner rather than later. It also draws on and moves a step forward from what we wrote in a national interest piece in October 2020, of which I will share a link with you, both of the text and also the video version with the description of this video. Let's make the principal point on Gaza first, as what's playing out there right now isn't open to much debate. It is a brutal retaliation, collective punishment, and mass revenge being delivered by an angry sovereign power with the strongest military in the entire Middle East and beyond. What Hamas carried out on 7 October was a hate crime against Israelis and Jews at a mass level. But Israel's revenge and punishment against the malevolent and terrorist Hamas in its magnitude and indiscriminate nature is already looking like a retaliatory mass hate crime against Gaza Palestinians and on a broader plane against Muslims. It has become counterproductive already, embarrassing Israel's friends and uniting its critics. America apart, almost all of Israel's significant friends have spoken up, expressing more or less similar views, asking for stopping the violence, indiscriminate violence against civilians, and also supporting a two-state solution. They have also abstained from voting on the UN General Assembly resolution asking for a ceasefire. Those who abstained include India among Israel's and Netanyahu's closest friends now. It won't bother Netanyahu's Israel. Who abstains, who says what, they'll carry on. Therefore, the question we need to ask now is, could Israel have been just as nonchalant if it had faced a united challenge from the Islamic world? If the Muslim world were a real political pan-national entity, it would add up to nearly 2 billion people, that is 200 crore people, or 1/4 of the world's population today. In comparison, Jews account for 16 million or 1.6 crores or 0.2% of the world's population. Are the Muslims largely poor and the Jews rich, and thereby is a mismatch in their relative power strength to be expected? Muslims are about 25% of the global population. They also account for nearly 23% of the world's GDP. That isn't insignificant power. What do the Jews account for? Jewish people are spread across the world, and while they lead many financial institutions, they do not see themselves as one nation or one power. Nor do they secretly own the world as conspiracy theories say. They identify with the Israeli Jews, but even today in major urban centers and campuses across the Western world, where much of the global wealth resides or is transacted, significant numbers of Jews have come out in protest against the severity of the Israeli response. We haven't seen any such response from the Muslim groups. Even among the governments of Muslim majority nations, those who have uttered words of condemnation for Hamas can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Egypt, in one CC statement or utterance during the Blinken visit that was widely quoted in Western media and not denied, the UAE, and probably one or two more, although I struggle to find them. Think about it. A force representing 1/4 of the world's population, the same proportion of its economy, holding a bulk of the global energy reserves, much military power, including nuclear weapons, don't forget Pakistan, and 150 times the Jewish population, has failed to deter Israel. If anything, Israel is able to toss this off, and I use that expression carefully, with contempt. What then is the power of the Islamic world, or what is commonly described as the Ummah? The dictionary meaning of which is, and I quote from the dictionary, the whole community of Muslims bound together by ties of religion, unquote. Translated, it means that all the Muslims of the world are united in a pan-national entity by their faith. Which brings us to some further questions. Is there such a thing as the Islamic world? Does a faith, any faith, transcend national boundaries or nationalist sentiment? By reigniting the Middle East just when we had begun to believe it had gone into deep sleep and peace and reconciliation had broken out after the Abraham Accords, Hamas has also underlined the many contradictions within and questions about the Islamic world. Islam is unique in that no other major faith sees itself as a pan-national entity today in loyalty, motivation and commitment of its adherents. There is no Christian equivalent or dream of an Ummah equivalent. In fact, the Christian nations stopped fighting together as Christians after the Crusades. The third most numerous faith, the Hindus, might have arguments among themselves, but only over whether their country, India, is a Hindu Rashtra or not. The Jews have one country of their own, that's Israel. The deepest contradiction within political Islam, as distinct from the faith and its practice and customs, we have to be careful in underlining that. The deepest contradiction comes from the belief that religious loyalties should take precedence over national loyalties, or religion should take precedence over nationalism. The result is the Ummah fantasy. The world's Muslims have set up multiple identity-based pan-national organizations. The most prominent is the OIC, or Organization of Islamic Cooperation, with its 57 member states and 5 observer states. These represent 23% of the world's GDP. Their achievements as a collective, however, for any common Islamic cause are zilch. Every now and then they might issue a statement on Kashmir. In the past, India used to get irritated. Now, very often, sometimes India even chooses to ignore these. There's been the Arab League and some other regional organizations in Africa and Asia, but none has counted for much on anything seen as a pan-Islamic issue. And Erdogan or Mahathir speaking by themselves, or the Iranians asserting as a nation, all of them are taken more seriously than any multi-country Islamic organization. The only pan-national organization of Muslim nations making an impact is the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, and it is the most West-friendly of these clubs of Islamic nations. 2 of its key members joined the Abraham Accords, and the third was on the verge of doing so when Hamas struck. Its adversary, the GCC's adversary, if anything, is a fellow Islamic nation in Iran. Qatar, though a member of the GCC, sits on the periphery geographically and politically, managing its own deep ties with Iran, the US, and the most anti-Western non-state actors in the region, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Qatar, let's simply say, plays just playing Qatar. If we step back and look at the so-called Islamic world's history with conflict, we will find that almost all of it in the past 50 years has been within itself. We take 1973 as the cutoff because that was the last time some Muslim countries joined hands to fight a common non-Muslim enemy. That is Egypt and Syria combining against Israel in the Yom Kippur War. It could be argued, however, that both, led by Ba'athist in case of Egypt, maybe formerly Ba'athist, pro-Soviet and supposedly socialist dictators were still not exactly Islamic powers. Oil-producing Muslim countries did come together with this war to cartelize and raise the price of oil. Never mind that it ended up benefiting them more commercially than causing as much strategic damage to Israel or its allies, essentially its American ally. Look, on the other hand, at armed conflicts within this world, the Muslim world. Again, let's acknowledge that the thousands of Muslim civilians killed in Gaza, including women and children, are thousands too many. Then contrast it with the war between the US-backed Saudi forces and Yemen's Houthis. The UK-based Campaign Against Arms Trade, that is caat.org.uk, that lists more than 3.77 lakh killed, all of them Muslim. 3.77 lakh killed, at least 1.5 lakh of them as a direct result of the fighting. The rest because of starvation, because of breakdown in order, because of breakdown in hospitalization, in healthcare, etc. In the never-ending civil war in Sudan, nearly 3 lakh have been killed in the past decade, in addition to another 2 lakh or so who were documented to have been killed earlier in its Darfur province. Nearly 4 lakh Muslims have been killed. In fact, some estimates, credible estimates, put it at 500,000. They've been killed in the civil war in Syria. Almost all the million plus Muslims killed across the world in the past decade or so have been killed by fellow Muslims, barring about 5,000 to 7,000 each, if that many, by the Americans and the Russians acting for the Assad regime in Syria. If we go backwards, if we go backwards beyond a decade, then you will find many killed by the Americans in Afghanistan and before that in Iraq, but again the numbers will not be compared to what we've seen in the last 10 years or so. We know the history of the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. The AFPAC, the Mujahideen to Taliban and back, nearly 80,000 killed in terrorism of various kinds, mostly sectarian terrorism in Pakistan. And while it is fashionable to blame the West for all the crises in the Muslim world, it was Saddam Hussein's Iraq that peremptorily occupied Kuwait. And it was Islamic powers, mostly Arab powers, that pleaded with the Americans to come and liberate it. Among the press corps covering that war, there was a cruel joke. What should be the anthem of the Saudi and the allied Muslim nations' armies, including, by the way, some elements from Pakistan? It should be Onward Christian Soldiers, because the Americans and the Western powers had been summoned in to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein and also to protect other Arab states from expansion by Saddam Hussein and his armies. One key reason a powerful community of 200 crore punches so far below its weight is that it is beset with so many conflicts and contradictions of its own. The most self-destructive and self-defeating of these is the failure to accept that nationalism and often even ideology are much stronger sentiments across the cross-border loyalties of a shared religion. This fantasy of faith-based unity has once again been laid bare by the Muslim world's failure to influence Israel's conduct of its Gaza war. Benjamin Netanyahu or any Israeli leader of the day always works on this safe presumption.